The staff car rounds the bend at 0822 on August 22, 1944, and Captain Tommy Macpherson steps into the middle of the road as if he owns it. He is 24 years old, 5 feet 9 inches of Scottish aristocrat wrapped in a Cameron Highlanders kilt, a tam o' shanter cocked at a jaunty angle, and the ribbon of the military cross pinned to his chest beside the French Croix de Guerre. His red hair catches the morning sun. His blue eyes betray nothing, not the fear that should be there, not the absurdity of what he is about to attempt. He raises one hand, palm outward, and the German column grinds to a halt. Behind him, hidden in the woods that line this narrow French road, 15 Maquis fighters clutch their Sten guns and wonder if their British commander has finally lost his mind. They are farm boys and shopkeepers, men who joined the resistance to fight Germans, not to watch a madman in a skirt try to stop a Panzer Division with nothing but audacity. They have perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition between them. The Germans have tanks. The column stretching back along the road belongs to elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the same unit that burned the village of Oradour-sur-Glane 2 months earlier, machine gunning 642 civilians, including 247 children. The same unit that hanged 99 hostages from lampposts in Toul. These are not conscripts or garrison troops. These are killers, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who have committed atrocities that will haunt France for generations. And they are staring at a single British officer who has just demanded that their commander come forward to discuss terms of surrender. Tommy waits, the seconds stretch. He can feel the weight of dozens of German eyes, can sense fingers tightening on triggers, can hear the diesel rumble of engines that could crush him without slowing down. His heart pounds against his ribs, but his face remains a mask of aristocratic boredom, the expression of a man who has done this 100 times before, who finds the whole business rather tedious, who is conferring a favor on the Germans by offering them a way out. An officer emerges from the lead vehicle. He is a major, perhaps 40, with the hard face of a career soldier and the lightning bolts of the SS on his collar. He walks towards Tommy with the careful steps of a man approaching something he does not understand. "You wish to speak with me?" The German's French is adequate. Tommy responds in flawless German. "I wish to speak with your commanding officer, not his subordinates." The major's eyes narrow. He studies the Scotsman, the kilt, the medals, the impossible confidence, and something shifts in his expression. Uncertainty, the beginning of doubt. "Who are you?" "I am the representative of the Allied forces in this sector. Your division is surrounded. Further resistance will result in unnecessary casualties on both sides. I am authorized to accept your surrender under the terms of the Geneva Convention." It is a lie. Every word of it is a lie. Tommy represents no one but himself and 15 terrified Frenchmen. There are no Allied forces in this sector. The nearest regular troops are hundreds of kilometers away. The Germans could kill him where he stands, slaughter his Maquis, and continue their retreat without consequence. But the major does not know this. He sees only what Tommy wants him to see. A British officer in full dress uniform, speaking perfect German, acting as if the outcome is already decided. "Wait here," the major says. He returns to the column. Tommy stands in the road, alone, watching the Germans confer in urgent whispers. He has played this game before, in Italy, in a dozen POW camps, in the mountains of occupied France. He has learned that authority is a performance, that power belongs to whoever claims it most convincingly, that men with guns will hesitate before a man with certainty. He has learned to bluff. The question now is whether the bluff will hold or whether he has finally pushed his luck too far. Thomas Macpherson was born to inherit a world that no longer exists. He arrived on October 6, 1920 in Edinburgh, Scotland,
the son of a family whose roots stretched back through generations of Highland gentry, lawyers, landowners, men who had served the crown in wars that were already fading into romantic memory. His father was a successful solicitor. His mother presided over a household that employed servants and observed traditions that the 20th century was rapidly making obsolete. Tommy grew up speaking the King's English at the dinner table and broad Scots with the gamekeepers on his family's estate, learning early that a gentleman must know how to move between worlds. The house in Edinburgh's New Town was filled with books, legal volumes, histories, the collected works of Walter Scott that every Scottish family of standing kept on prominent display. Tommy devoured them all, but he was never the contemplative type. He was physical, restless, possessed of an energy that his tutors struggled to channel. He excelled at rugby, at cricket, at any sport that involved controlled violence. He was small for his age, but fast, and he learned to compensate for his size with aggression and guile. Larger boys discovered that Tommy Macpherson did not stay down when knocked over. He got up, smiled, and came at them again until they wished they had chosen an easier target. Fettes College taught him discipline, or at least the appearance of discipline. The Edinburgh Public School, public in the British sense, meaning expensive and exclusive, specialized in producing young men who could command other men, future officers, administrators, leaders of empire. Tommy absorbed the lessons that mattered: how to address superiors without groveling, how to speak to subordinates without condescension, how to wear authority like a second skin. He also absorbed the languages that Fettes considered essential for a young gentleman: French first, then German, then Italian. His accent in each was impeccable. His teachers noted that Tommy had an ear for mimicry, could reproduce any sound or inflection after hearing it once, could pass for a native speaker in rooms full of natives.
Oxford came next, Trinity College, reading law, because that was what Macpherson men did. The dreaming spires and ancient quadrangles should have been the setting for 3 years of comfortable intellectual development, the final polishing before Tommy took his place in Edinburgh's legal establishment. Instead, they became a holding pattern, a waiting room for the war that everyone could see coming. Tommy attended lectures and wrote essays and rode for his college, but his attention was elsewhere. He read the newspapers with growing unease, watched the grainy newsreels of German troops marching into the Rhineland, into Austria, into Czechoslovakia. He knew, they all knew, that the old world his family represented was about to be tested as it had not been tested since 1914. When war finally came in September 1939, Tommy did not wait to be called. He volunteered immediately, seeking a commission in the Queen's own Cameron Highlanders, the regiment that had recruited from his corner of Scotland for 2 centuries, the regiment whose tartan he had a right to wear by birth and tradition. The Camerons accepted him without hesitation. He was exactly the kind of young officer they wanted: educated, athletic, fluent in languages, possessed of the effortless confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. Basic training at Fort George taught him the mechanics of soldiering: how to shoot, how to navigate, how to lead men through terrain that wanted to kill them. But Tommy already understood the deeper truth that training could not teach: that military authority was theater, that officers commanded not because they were stronger or smarter than their men, but because everyone agreed to pretend they were. The kilt he wore was part of that theater. The Germans called Highland regiments the Ladies from Hell, a nickname earned in the trenches of the First World War. Tommy intended to make them remember why. By 1941, he was in North Africa, commanding a platoon in a war that was about to teach him lessons no school could provide. The Western Desert was nothing like Scotland. Tommy arrived in Egypt in the spring of 1941, stepping off the troop ship into a wall of heat that seemed to press against his skin like a physical weight. The air smelled of dust and diesel, of sweat and the strange spices that wafted from the Cairo markets. The Cameron Highlanders had traded their kilts for khaki shorts. Even Highland tradition bowed to temperatures that could kill a man in wool. But they carried the same swagger,
the same certainty that Scottish infantry could handle whatever Rommel threw at them. The Western Desert was a strange conflict, fought across vast expanses of nothing by armies that chased each other back and forth like tides. There were no civilians to worry about, no towns to capture or defend, only the enemy and the endless sand and the brutal arithmetic of fuel and water. Tommy learned to navigate by stars and compass, to read the shimmer of heat mirages, to distinguish the dust plume of a friendly column from the dust plume of German panzers. He learned that the desert was honest in a way that other battlefields were not. It did not hide its dangers, it simply waited for men to make mistakes. His first taste of serious combat came at Sidi Rezek in November 1941, a chaotic battle that swirled across the Libyan desert for days. The Cameron Highlanders held a ridge against repeated German attacks, their rifles and machine guns cutting down infantry that emerged from the dust like ghosts. Tommy commanded his platoon with the calm that his training had promised, moving among his men, directing fire, treating the chaos around him as a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be survived. When it was over, when the Germans finally withdrew and the stretcher-bearers began their grim work, his commanding officer recommended him for the Military Cross. The citation praised his coolness under fire, his leadership, his disregard for personal safety. Tommy accepted the medal with the self-deprecating shrug that his class considered appropriate, but privately he understood that something had changed. He had discovered that he was good at war, not just competent, but genuinely good, possessed of instincts that could not be taught and nerves that did not fail when other men's nerves failed. The discovery was troubling in ways he did not examine too closely. Before you navigate away, remember to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you the untold stories of military history that changed the world 3 times a week. Don't miss the next one. His luck ran out in the summer of 1942. The British position in North Africa was crumbling. Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed them back to the Egyptian border, threatening Cairo itself. Tommy volunteered for a commando raid behind enemy lines, a desperate mission to destroy fuel dumps that were feeding the German advance. The raid went wrong almost immediately. Intelligence was faulty. German patrols were thicker than expected. Tommy's small team found themselves surrounded in a wadi as the sun came up, outnumbered and outgunned, with no possibility of escape. He ordered his men to surrender. It was the rational decision, the only decision, but it burned in his chest like acid. Tommy Macpherson had never surrendered anything in his life. He had never quit a rugby match, never conceded a point in debate, never admitted that any obstacle was beyond him. Now he stood with his hands raised while German soldiers stripped him of his weapons and his dignity, while they prodded him toward a truck that would carry him to a prison camp somewhere in Italy. The Germans were professionally correct. They searched him, took his identification, logged him as a prisoner of war. An officer examined his military cross ribbon and nodded with something like respect. Soldiers recognized courage even in enemies. Tommy was loaded onto a transport with 24 other captured British officers, men whose war had ended in the same sudden, bewildering fashion. But as the truck rumbled north toward the coast, Tommy was not thinking about the war he had lost. He was thinking about the war he was about to begin, a private war, not with rifles and grenades, but with cunning and nerve, a war to escape the cages they were building for him. He would not remain a prisoner. He did not know how yet, but he knew. The Italian prisoner of war camp at Chieti sat on a hilltop in the Abruzzo region, a converted military barracks surrounded by wire and guard towers that offered sweeping views of countryside Tommy was determined to cross. He arrived in August 1942, one of several hundred British officers warehoused in facilities that the Italian military administered with a curious mixture of harshness and indifference. The guards were not cruel, not like the Germans, not like the Japanese, but they were thorough, and the camp was designed by men who understood that officers were more likely to attempt escape than enlisted men. Tommy began planning within hours of his arrival. He walked the perimeter, counting guards, timing patrols, noting the places where shadows pooled at night and the places where searchlights swept with predictable rhythm. He studied the wire, 2 fences, 10 feet apart, with coiled barbed wire filling the gap between them. He studied the ground beneath the barracks, wondering if tunnels were possible, wondering how long it would take to dig through Italian soil with improvised tools. He studied his fellow prisoners, looking for men who shared his restlessness, men who rather risk death than accept captivity. The first attempt came in October. Tommy and 3 other officers cut through the inner wire during a rainstorm that masked their noise and limited visibility. They made it to the outer fence before a guard stumbled on them, literally stumbled, a young conscript who had wandered off his patrol route to relieve himself. The Italian was as surprised as they were. He shouted, they ran, and within minutes the camp was lit up like a football stadium, searchlights sweeping the perimeter, while guards fired warning shots into the darkness. Tommy was caught within the hour, dragged back to the camp and thrown into solitary confinement for 30 days. The cell was small, dark, and cold, the kind of hole designed to break a man's spirit through boredom and isolation. Tommy spent the time reviewing his mistakes, analyzing what had gone wrong, preparing for the next attempt. He did push-ups to maintain his strength. He practiced his Italian with the guards who brought his meager meals. He refused to let the darkness define him. The second attempt came in January 1943. This time Tommy went alone, reasoning that a single man could move faster and quieter than a group. He had spent weeks cultivating a relationship with an Italian orderly, a young man from Naples who hated the war and hated the Germans and could be persuaded, for a price, to look the other way at critical moments. The orderly provided a window of opportunity. Tommy slipped out during a shift change, scaled the fence at a point where the searchlight coverage was weakest, and vanished into the Italian night. He made it 70 kilometers before they caught him. 3 days of walking through mountain terrain, sleeping in barns and abandoned shepherds' huts, eating whatever he could steal from farms and orchards. His Italian was good enough to fool casual encounters, but a police checkpoint on the road to Switzerland demanded papers he did not have. The Carabiniers were apologetic. They seemed genuinely impressed by how far he had traveled. But they were also efficient. He was back in Kiti within a week. Solitary again, 60 days this time. Tommy used the hours to refine his understanding of what had gone wrong. Papers. He needed papers. He needed documents that would survive scrutiny, an identity that would hold up under questioning. He began to study the art of forgery, learning from other prisoners who had talents in that direction, memorizing the formats of Italian identity cards and travel permits. He learned that deception was not just about lying, it was about creating a reality so complete that the audience never thought to question it. The third attempt came in spring. Tommy had papers this time, crude forgeries but adequate for rural checkpoints. He had civilian clothes smuggled into the camp by the same orderly who had helped before. He had a route planned, contacts arranged, a chain of safe houses that resistant sympathizers had established for exactly this purpose. He made it to within 5 kilometers of the Swiss border before an Italian patrol picked him up. So close he could taste freedom, so close he could see the mountains that marked neutral territory. They dragged him back to a different camp this time, one reserved for what the Italians called incorrigibles, prisoners who refused to accept their captivity, who kept trying until they succeeded or died. Tommy intended to keep trying. The camp for incorrigibles was located near Modena, a grim facility where the Italians concentrated the prisoners they considered most troublesome. Tommy arrived in June 1943 to find himself among men who had escaped 3, 4, 5 times, officers who refused to accept that the war was over for them, who treated captivity as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. They were kindred spirits. They spent their days planning, probing, preparing for the moment when opportunity would present itself. That moment came on September 8, 1943. Tommy was in the exercise yard when the news arrived, passed from prisoner to prisoner in excited whispers. Italy had surrendered. The war, Italy's war at least, was over. The guards were confused, their officers absent, the entire apparatus of captivity suddenly uncertain of its purpose. For perhaps 2 hours, the camp existed in a strange limbo, neither prison nor freedom, while men who controlled other men's lives waited to learn who would be giving orders next.
Tommy did not wait. He understood immediately what the Italian surrender meant and what it did not mean. The Germans would move quickly to secure prisoner of war camps to prevent thousands of trained British officers from rejoining the fight. Every hour of hesitation was an hour lost. He gathered the men he had come to trust, the fellow incorrigibles who shared his appetite for risk, and they went over the wire while the guards were still debating whether to stop them. The Alps in September were beautiful and deadly. Tommy led his small group north through terrain that shifted from farmland to foothills to mountains that scraped the sky. They traveled by night, hiding during the day in caves and abandoned barns, eating whatever they could find or steal. The Germans were everywhere now, panzers rolling south to fill the vacuum left by Italy's collapse, patrols hunting for exactly the kind of escaped prisoners Tommy and his companions represented. They heard gunfire in the distance, saw villages burning on the horizon, passed refugees fleeing in both directions from a war that had suddenly become everyone's war. The crossing itself took 8 days. 8 days of climbing through passes that had no names on any map Tommy had seen. 8 days of frozen nights and exhausting days. 8 days of wondering if the next ridge would reveal salvation or a German checkpoint. His feet blistered and bled. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air. But he kept moving, kept pushing, kept refusing to accept that the mountains could defeat him when 3 Italian prison camps had failed. Switzerland appeared on a crystalline September morning. Neutral territory, safety, the end of a journey that had begun 18 months earlier in the Libyan desert. Tommy crossed the border with 4 other officers, all of them barely able to stand, all of them grinning like schoolboys who had pulled off an impossible prank. The Swiss interned them, of course. Neutrality had its protocols, but internment in Switzerland was a different universe from captivity in Italy. There were beds and food and letters home, and eventually arrangements for repatriation to Britain. Tommy reached London in early 1944, one of thousands of escaped prisoners filtering back to a country that had changed enormously in his absence. The Blitz was over. The Americans had arrived. The invasion of Europe was clearly imminent. Everyone could feel it, the coiled tension of an army preparing to spring. Tommy reported to the War Office, expecting reassignment to his regiment, expecting to lead a platoon in the liberation of France, expecting the conventional military career that his escape had merely interrupted. The War Office had other ideas. The Special Operations Executive had been watching Tommy Macpherson for some time. SOE was Churchill's secret army. Saboteurs, assassins, agents who operated behind enemy lines with no uniforms, no rules, and no expectation of mercy if captured. They recruited from the pool of officers who had demonstrated unusual skills, languages, resilience, the ability to think independently in impossible situations. Tommy's 3 escape attempts, his fluent German and Italian, his talent for deception, his apparent inability to accept defeat made him exactly what SOE was looking for. The recruiter was a quiet man in civilian clothes who met Tommy in a nondescript office near Baker Street. He explained nothing about the organization he represented, asked questions that seemed random but were clearly probing for something specific. At the end of an hour, he made an offer. "We have work for a man of your talents, dangerous work, the kind of work where the rules don't apply." Tommy did not hesitate. "When do I start?" SOE training was designed to break men who could not be broken and remake them into something new. Tommy arrived at the organization's secret facilities in Scotland, not far from where he had grown up, an irony that amused him, and spent 3 months learning the dark arts of unconventional warfare. He learned to kill silently with knives and garrots. He learned to use explosives,
to derail trains, to sabotage factories with devices that would detonate hours or days after he had vanished. He learned to parachute from aircraft, to land in darkness on terrain he had never seen, to trust his life to a silk canopy and the skill of pilots who flew without lights over occupied territory. The instructors pushed him hard, searching for weaknesses that combat and captivity had not revealed. They woke him in the middle of the night for interrogations, playing the role of Gestapo officers, testing whether he could maintain his cover story under pressure. Tommy found these exercises almost relaxing. He had been interrogated by real Italians after real escape attempts. He had spent months in solitary confinement with nothing but his thoughts for company. The play-acting of Scottish instructors held no terror for him. His operational briefing came in late May 1944. D-Day was imminent. Everyone knew it, though no one spoke the date out loud. And SOE was preparing to unleash chaos across occupied France. Tommy's mission was designated Operation Doyen. He would parachute into the Lot region of southern France, link up with local Maquis resistance groups, and conduct operations to delay German reinforcements heading north toward the invasion beaches. The briefing officer stressed that his primary value was organizational. The Maquis were brave but poorly coordinated, and they needed a professional soldier to transform their enthusiasm into military effectiveness. Tommy listened politely and decided to interpret his orders creatively. The aircraft lifted off from RAF Thamesford on the night of June 8, 1944, 2 days after Allied forces had stormed ashore in Normandy, 2 days into the battle that would determine Europe's fate. Tommy sat in the fuselage of a Hallux bomber, dressed in a manner that would have given his briefing officers fits if they had known. He wore his Cameron Highlander kilt. He wore his tam o' shanter. He wore his military cross ribbon and the French Croix de Guerre that the government in exile had awarded him for his North African service. He looked less like a secret agent than like a Highland chieftain preparing for a formal dinner.
The other agents on the aircraft, men in civilian clothes, men who would pretend to be French laborers and traveling salesmen, stared at him with expressions ranging from amusement to horror. "You're wearing that?" one of them asked. Tommy smiled. "The Germans know what a British officer looks like. They know how to deal with spies, but they have no idea what to do with a man in a kilt." The drop zone was a meadow near the village of Cardillac, marked by bonfires that the Maquis had lit in defiance of every German regulation about light discipline. Tommy jumped at 0200, felt the familiar jerk of the parachute deploying, and descended through darkness toward a country he was about to turn upside down. He landed hard, rolled, and was immediately surrounded by men with Sten guns and suspicious expressions. The Maquis had expected a secret agent. They got something else entirely. Their leader was a farmer named Jacques, a weathered man in his 40s who had been fighting the Germans since 1942 and lost 3 brothers to Nazi reprisals. He looked at Tommy's kilt, at his medals, at the impossible figure who had materialized from the night sky, and did not know whether to laugh or shoot him. "You are the British officer?" "Captain Thomas Macpherson, Cameron Highlanders." Tommy's French was flawless, his accent placing him precisely in the educated Parisian circles he had visited before the war. "I understand you have some Germans who need killing." Jacques stared at him for a long moment. Then he began to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that spread through the assembled Maquis like fire through dry grass. This madman in a skirt was either going to get them all killed or win the war single-handedly. Either way, it would not be boring. The Maquis of the Lot region numbered perhaps 300 men, scattered across dozens of villages and farmsteads, in groups that ranged from a handful to a few dozen. They were brave, Tommy never doubted their courage, but they were also disorganized, poorly armed, and utterly unprepared for the kind of conventional warfare that the German occupation forces could bring to bear. They had rifles from the last war,
a few Sten guns dropped by the RAF, and an enthusiasm for killing Germans that exceeded their ability to do so effectively. A direct confrontation with regular Wehrmacht troops would end in massacre. Tommy understood this within days of his arrival. He also understood something that his briefing officers in London had not grasped. The Germans were afraid, not of the Maquis specifically, but of the unknown, of the forces that might be lurking in the forests and hills, of the invasion that had cracked open Fortress Europe, of the possibility that their comfortable occupation was about to become a desperate retreat. Fear was a weapon. Tommy intended to use it. His first operation set the pattern. A German convoy was scheduled to pass through the region, supply trucks heading north toward Normandy, exactly the kind of target SOE wanted him to interdict. A conventional ambush would destroy a few vehicles and bring reprisals down on local villages. Tommy proposed something different. He positioned his Maquis along a ridge overlooking the road, spread far apart to suggest greater numbers, and waited for the convoy to enter the kill zone. When the trucks appeared, Tommy did not order an attack. Instead, he walked down to the road, alone in his kilt and tam-o'-shanter, his medals glinting in the afternoon sun, and raised his hand for the convoy to stop. The German sergeant in the lead vehicle stared at him as if confronting an apparition. "This road is closed. Allied forces control this sector. You will turn around and find another route." The sergeant looked at the hillsides, at the scattered figures half visible among the trees, at the British officer who addressed him with the casual authority of a man commanding thousands. He did not know that those figures were farmers with ancient rifles. He did not know that Tommy's Allied forces consisted of 15 men and a wireless set. He knew only that the invasion had begun, that the world was changing, and that this strange apparition in a skirt seemed utterly certain of his own power. The convoy turned around. If you're enjoying this story of how one man's audacity bluffed an entire German occupation, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves military history. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Word spread among the Germans and among the Maquis. Tommy cultivated his reputation deliberately, appearing at German checkpoints to deliver warnings, allowing himself to be seen in villages where collaborators would report his presence, creating the impression of a British force that was everywhere and nowhere. He attacked supply depots and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. He cut telephone lines and mined roads, then sent messages through intermediaries claiming credit for a network of Allied commandos operating throughout the region. The Germans began to believe. They had no way to verify Tommy's claims, no intelligence that could penetrate the fog of war that had descended on southern France. They knew only that a British officer was operating in their sector, that attacks were increasing, that their communications were compromised. They reinforced garrisons that did not need reinforcing. They diverted troops to hunt phantoms. They began to treat every shadow as a potential threat. Tommy's wireless operator transmitted regular reports to London, cataloging the chaos they were creating. The numbers were impressive: convoys delayed, supplies destroyed, German forces tied down guarding against attacks that might never come. But Tommy was not satisfied with harassment. He wanted something larger, something that would justify the risk he had taken by parachuting into occupied territory in full Highland dress. In August, he got his chance. Intelligence reported that elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division were moving through his sector, retreating south after weeks of fighting in Normandy. Das Reich, the most feared division in the German army, the perpetrators of atrocities that shocked even a war-hardened world. Tommy began planning the biggest bluff of his life. The intelligence arrived on August 20th, 1944. Fragments of information pieced together from Maquis scouts, intercepted communications, and the terrified whispers of French civilians who had seen the column passing through neighboring villages. Das Reich was moving south in force, thousands of troops with tanks and armored vehicles, retreating from a Normandy campaign that had cost them dearly but had not broken them. They were still dangerous, still capable of devastating any force that challenged them directly, still the same killers who had machine-gunned children in Oradour-sur-Glane. Tommy gathered his lieutenants, Jacques and a handful of other Maquis leaders who had learned to trust the madman in the kilt, and explained what he intended to do. The reaction was what he expected: disbelief, then alarm, then the slow dawning recognition that Tommy was completely serious. "You want to stop an SS Panzer Division," Jacques said carefully, "with 15 men? I want to convince an SS Panzer Division that they are already stopped. There is a difference." The difference, Tommy explained, was psychology. Das Reich had been fighting for months. They had lost men, lost equipment, lost the certainty of victory that had carried them across Europe. They were retreating through hostile territory, harassed by resistance fighters, cut off from reliable intelligence about Allied movements. They did not know where the enemy was. They did not know how strong the enemy was. They knew only that the war had turned against them and that every kilometer of retreat brought new dangers. Into that uncertainty, Tommy would inject a lie so audacious that it would become truth. He positioned his Maquis along a 2-kilometer stretch of the road the Germans would travel, spacing them far apart in the trees and hedgerows, instructing them to move constantly, to show themselves briefly and then vanish, to create the impression of a force 10 times their actual size. He established a command post at a farmhouse overlooking the road, complete with a wireless set that would crackle with fictitious communications from fictitious units. He rehearsed his story until every detail was perfect. The column appeared on August 22nd, the same column that Tommy had stopped in the cold light of dawn, the same SS major who had walked forward to confront the impossible Scotsmen blocking his path. The major had returned to confer with his superiors, and now a staff car was approaching the farmhouse where Tommy waited. A colonel emerged from the vehicle. He was perhaps 50, with the Iron Cross at his throat and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much war. He looked at Tommy, at the kilt, the medals, the absurd confidence, and his expression was unreadable. "You claim to represent Allied forces," the colonel said in German. "Show me your forces." Tommy had prepared for this. He led the colonel to a window overlooking the valley, pointed to the scattered figures visible among the trees, and began to narrate a fiction with the same conviction he had used to argue cases at Oxford. "1st Battalion is positioned along the northern ridge. 2nd Battalion holds the crossroads to the east. 3rd Battalion is in reserve, prepared to block your retreat if you attempt to withdraw. Artillery is registered on your current position." He gestured vaguely toward hills where no artillery existed. "My commanding general has authorized me to accept your surrender. He has also authorized me to call in an airstrike if you decline." The colonel studied the landscape. He could see figures moving, Tommy's 15 Maquis circulating through the woods, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. He could not count them accurately. He could not determine their armament. He could only see what Tommy wanted him to see, evidence of a trap that had already closed. "How many men do you have?" Tommy smiled, the smile of a man holding a winning hand, the smile he had practiced in 100 negotiations. "Enough." The silence stretched. The colonel looked at his column, at the tanks and trucks and thousands of men who could crush this force if they only knew how small it was. He looked at Tommy, at the impossible certainty that radiated from this strange officer in his ridiculous skirt. "What terms do you offer?" Tommy felt his heart pounding, but his voice remained steady. "Honorable surrender under the Geneva Convention. Your men will be treated as prisoners of war. Officers may retain their sidearms. You have my word as a British officer." The colonel considered. Behind him, his division waited for orders that would determine whether they lived or died. "Very well," he said finally, "we surrender." The surrender of Das Reich elements was only the beginning. As word spread through German units retreating across southern France, something remarkable happened. Commanders began seeking out the British officer in the kilt, hoping to negotiate their own capitulations. They had heard the stories, the Phantom Army, the officer who spoke perfect German, the promise of fair treatment under the Geneva Convention. In a war where SS troops could expect little mercy from the Maquis they had brutalized for years, Tommy Macpherson offered something invaluable: legitimacy. He accepted surrenders like a man collecting debts, a garrison here, a retreating column there, units that materialized from the chaos of the German collapse and laid down their weapons before the Scotsmen who seemed to be everywhere at once. His 15 Maquis swelled to 50, then 100, as French fighters emerged from hiding to join what was obviously the winning side. But even with reinforcements, Tommy remained absurdly outnumbered by the prisoners he was accumulating. He solved the problem with the same audacity that had created it. He made the Germans guard themselves, appointing their own officers to maintain discipline while he moved on to accept the next surrender.
The numbers mounted through August and into September. 200 prisoners, 500, 1,000. German units that had terrorized France for 4 years marched into captivity under the direction of a single British captain who had bluffed them into believing resistance was futile. Tommy barely slept, moving constantly between surrender negotiations, prisoner transfers, and the occasional sharp firefight with units that refused to believe the war was over. His kilt became famous. Germans who had never seen him recognized the description, passed the word that the officer in the skirt could be trusted. By the time Allied forces finally reached his sector in mid-September, Tommy Macpherson had personally accepted the surrender of 23,000 German soldiers. 23,000 men, more prisoners than most divisions captured in an entire campaign, taken by an officer whose army never exceeded a few hundred lightly armed resistance fighters. The achievement was so improbable that his initial reports were met with skepticism. Staff officers assumed the numbers were exaggerated, the product of combat stress or French enthusiasm for embellishment. Then they met Tommy and understood that nothing about this man was ordinary. The war ended 8 months later. Tommy returned to Britain draped in medals from 3 nations, the Military Cross with 2 bars from his own country, the Croix de Guerre and Légion d'honneur from France, decorations from the Netherlands for operations he conducted there in the war's final months. He was 24 years old and accomplished more than most soldiers achieve in a lifetime. He never spoke of his achievements with pride. In interviews decades later, he described the surrender of Das Reich as though it had been a minor administrative matter, a bit of necessary improvisation that anyone might have managed under the circumstances. He claimed no special courage, no extraordinary ability, only the willingness to act when action was required, and the conviction that authority belonged to whoever was bold enough to claim it. After the war, he finished his law degree at Oxford, then embarked on a business career that proved as successful as his military one. He chaired multiple companies, served on countless boards, and was eventually knighted for services to industry and charity. Sir Thomas Macpherson became a pillar of the Scottish establishment that had produced him, the kind of man whose obituary would fill multiple columns in the Times. He died on November 6, 2014, at the age of 94. The obituaries mentioned his war record, the escapes, the parachute drop in a kilt, the impossible surrenders, but they could not quite capture what Tommy had understood instinctively and proven repeatedly under fire. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won with will. The side that believes it has lost has already lost, regardless of how many tanks it commands. And a single man who refuses to accept defeat can sometimes, just sometimes, defeat an army.
23,000 prisoners, 15 men, and a kilt. The greatest bluff of the Second World War.